Good day, everyone. This is lecture 11, and today we want to look at the other great Renaissance thinkers. The three thinkers that we'll be looking at today are three thinkers within the British tradition of philosophy. In the last two lectures, we spoke about the European rationalists, starting with Descartes, father of modern philosophy. And we saw how rationalism took different forms or turns in the hands of Baruch Spinoza and Leibniz. That was an entirely different tradition of rationalism from the tradition that developed on the other side of the British Channel. In the three kingdoms, right, England, Scotland, and Ireland, a different philosophical tone or culture was developing. One that did not negate the significance of reason, but did not give reason that central role in the task of epistemology, in establishing the foundations of knowledge. In the British tradition, knowledge was essentially based on experience. And when we talk about experience, we're talking primarily of the experience of the senses, the experience of the body. It was through perception that we saw, that we envisaged the world. The powers of sight, of hearing, or sound, of smell and taste and touch, these were central. That whole sensory apparatus was fundamental to the reception of knowledge of the external world, because knowledge needs to be knowledge of the external world. It gives us the instruments to navigate the reality of the external world. And even though the significance of reason is not denied in the British tradition, reason can only work with the data or the stimuli that come from the external world, the sense data that is registered on consciousness. And that British tradition can be traced very early, actually, even before the Renaissance period. In fact, during the 13th century, there was a British friar or monk who had enunciated that stress on empiricism, or the empirical method, as a method that was as a chosen method in the pursuit of knowledge. And so, and his name was Roger Bacon, right? But we normally begin the discussion of the British empirical tradition from Francis Bacon. And Francis Bacon lived in the 16th century. So Roger Bacon was quite early, he was the 13th century. Francis Bacon lived in the 16th century, 1561 to 1626. And he is regarded as the father of British empiricism. He wrote a number of very interesting books. The books were considered to be celebrated in his day. A book called the Novum Organum. And the Novum Organum take its cue from Aristotle's Organon. This is the new Organon as it is. And in that new Organon, he states the centrality of the experimental method, or the method, the chosen method of scientific inquiry and investigation. And then there's another book that he published called The New Atlantis. And that's taken from the myth of Atlantis, which I think most people may be familiar with now. Atlantis was supposed to be a fabled city. It's talked about in Plato's writings, a famous city in which there was a high level of civilization attained in ancient times. And there was a massive destruction of Atlantis. There may be some historical truth in it, but nobody has been able to establish that. Atlantis, that's from which the Atlantic Ocean got its name. But Atlantis was supposed to have existed either somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, some people say even within the Greek Isles, But The New Atlantis was a book that, again, pointed to a radically new turn in philosophical discourse and investigation. And that new turn was to be found in the empirical tradition. And then there's another book also talk about the advancement of learning, and that's significant in that it really is a recognition on the part of the early Renaissance thinkers that there is a Renaissance taking place, that there is a revival of learning, that people are now moving beyond where the medievals had brought them. And they were now discovering new truths, coming up with a new notion of the world, a new philosophical outlook, a new worldview. And in the advancement of learning, it is in this text that that Bacon promotes the notion of natural philosophy. Natural philosophy really is what we refer to as the major natural sciences, physics and biology and so on. And here Bacon is advancing the notion of the significance, the central significance in all epistemological task of natural philosophy. And natural philosophy requires an investigation of the natural world through observation and through experiment. So Bacon's contribution was an extremely significant contribution. Bacon was considered to be probably the wisest man in England at the time. He was the outstanding scholar. He chose not so much of an academic life as a public life. He was a public figure. And he one time served as Lord Chancellor of England. And that's an extremely significant position. Today, chancellors in England work with prime ministers, but they take responsibility for the treasury and the finances of the kingdom. It's equivalent to what we'd call a minister of finance today. So famous was Francis Bacon that people even believe that he may have been the true William Shakespeare. I think there's a general worldwide consensus that William Shakespeare is the greatest playwright who ever lived and probably the greatest poet who ever lived. I have my doubts about that because a lot of the works of the ancient Greeks were lost, and what was remained of them is equivalent to Shakespeare's writings. But Shakespeare is considered to be the greatest English poet and certainly the greatest playwright who ever lived. Right? Very many people believe that there is no book outside of the Bible that contains as much wisdom as the writings of Shakespeare. But Shakespeare himself was merely an actor in the theater of the day. And it is difficult to believe that Shakespeare himself could have produced plays that purvey the level of wisdom and knowledge that those plays contain. And so many people believe that it may have been Bacon who was writing the plays of Shakespeare and passing it under the name of Shakespeare, because as an aristocrat, as a member of the aristocracy, as Lord Chancellor, and as a leading public figure, there was something a bit demeaning about associating with the theater and associating with actors and so on. So Bacon is even seen as the author of the plays of Shakespeare. Bacon's writings, as I said, however, in the field of philosophy and natural philosophy more especially, are very important, and they really lay the groundwork for the development of the British tradition of empiricism. And that tradition of British empiricism is something that came to characterize the national character of the British people, the ethos of the British people. Not that they did not have metaphysicians and so on, but it was always the empirical philosophers who were in the forefront of British thought. Little wonder that later the scientific revolution essentially was a British creation. The development of technology, right, was eventually a British creation. Little wonder, because they had laid the philosophical grounding for the scientific method, for the experimental method, and the whole tradition of British empirical thinking. Now, Bacon was followed by another very important Englishman, and that was Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes also was 16th, 17th century. Again, Hobbes is a contemporary of Descartes, right? But Descartes, well, all of them were actually, but Descartes' emphasis on the importance and the centrality of reason was something that fundamentally Hobbes had rejected. Hobbes continued the emphasis on the empiricist method, and in fact, Hobbes was so fiercely an empiricist that his philosophy was seen as a kind of materialism. It was a very materialistic philosopher. In fact, he didn't believe that mental objects really existed, that they were epiphenomenal, right? He believed that all that existed were the hard objects and facts in the natural world. And so believed that knowledge consisted of perceptions from the external world. We perceive external reality, that data is imprinted on our minds, and that is what constitutes knowledge. And therefore, when we reason, when we think, when we weigh ideas, when we analyze things, we are merely working on the data, the sense data that we receive from the external world through our senses. So Hobbes continued that tradition of British empiricism, and is considered certainly one of the founders of that whole philosophical school. But Hobbes was a philosopher who did a number of other things, right? He was a leading ethicist, and in fact, in a sense, he laid the foundations of that whole notion that ethics is based essentially on self-interest, that man is motivated by self-interest or self-love. That became a dominant tendency in British thought right into the 19th century and even beyond. That essentially all creatures, not merely human beings, but all creatures, all living creatures, are primarily occupied with their own individual survival, their personal selves, and everything is oriented around self-love or self-interest. That we are not altruistic at all. The notion of altruism, if it seems to appear, must be something that grows out of self-love, must be seen as instrumental to self-interest. And in order to arrive at that conclusion, what Hobbes did is that he invited his readers to look at man in what he called the state of nature. But that notion of the state of nature becomes quite a dominant philosophical idea after Hobbes, right? The concept that you have to, if you want to understand man and the true philosophical foundations of human nature and human being, you have to perceive man in the state of nature. And that's very important. And when Hobbes looked at man in the state of nature, he had an extremely pessimistic view of human being. In a state of nature, he says, there is a war of all against all. And I suppose from a standpoint of today, in the light of all of the discoveries of anthropologists, when we talk about a state of nature, we are going back to a hunter-gatherer society, a society in which people have not yet developed the tools of agriculture. There's not been any urbanization. People are not living in the grandeur and the magnificence of the lifestyle of the rich and the wealthy and the famous, right? Every human being is essentially a savage, what a later writer came to refer to as a noble savage, but for for Hobbes, he was not a noble savage. There was something base and there was something distasteful about the life of the individual in a state of nature. Hunting and gathering, warring not only against animals that were also the predators of the ancient wilderness, but he was also competing against other groups, other clans, right, other kinship groups, as he searched and foraged environment for food. Life in that environment, Hobbes defines as short, nasty, and brutish. These have become famous words, and words that really register the profound pessimism of Thomas Hobbes. Later on, we're going to talk about the whole humanistic tradition, but there's a sense in which when you look at Hobbes, Hobbes is hardly a humanist. The humanistic tradition, which we'll talk about later on, is a very optimistic one, which sees man as central, either from a Christian perspective or from a non-Christian perspective. Man is central. Man is the supreme work of God's creation in the Christian tradition. Or man stands at the head of the food chain, or the great chain of being, as the most complex and sophisticated and rational creature from a secularist or a non-Christian position. But humanisms tend to be very optimistic. There's a sense in which Hobbes's philosophy was an anti-humanist philosophy, a very pessimistic philosophy. And we're going to come to a number, especially when we get to the Enlightenment period, we are going to find that there are a number of other very pessimistic philosophers who see human life in very, very severe terms. Life for Hobbes is short, nasty, and brutish. And precisely because man is such a selfish creature, and life is so short, so nasty, and so brutish, we have to live in a society which is governed by a powerful ruler. And therefore, Hobbes supports monarchy. It's very interesting that he became a supporter of monarchy, right? Hobbes believes that rulers should be extremely powerful people, and they should be granted the authority and the privilege of making laws, of legislating laws for a people. Hobbes's monarchy or autocracy, these are other terms that refer to a government that is not accountable to anyone, a government that enjoys sovereign power, a government that does not share its power with the people. Then he argues that in that situation, right, the individual has to be submissive to government. The political life of the individual, therefore, is defined as a type of total submission to a supreme leader who is granted the authority to rule. Now, that is based on what he calls, and this will become a very important notion. In fact, it is a concept that still continues to be foundational to contemporary social and political and ethical thinking. He argues that in that state of nature, therefore, if people are to survive and if they are to improve the quality of their lives, they must enter into a social contract with each other and with the sovereign. So what binds the sovereign to his subjects is what he calls a social contract, a social contract theory. In a sense, it's a secularization of the notion of the covenantal relationship between God and his people. Remember that all of these thinkers essentially are still very Christian thinkers. All they're doing is that they're trying to find a new basis in reason for the leading and the dominant concepts of the Christian cultural, social, and ethical traditions. And so the social contract theory is a theory it's a theory that defines a relationship, not between man and God in this instance, but between the subject and the ruler. The ruler now is dominant. He must be given due obedience and obeisance. And he has a responsibility to his people, and that responsibility is to provide good governance, to ensure that there is security from the dangers around. It is only on the basis of that social contract referred to as social contract theory. It is only on the basis of that social contract that we can escape what Hobbes defines as a war of all against all, right? And so the Hobbesian system, right, is a system that is defined essentially by strong governance, by a monarchical preeminence, that laws are legislated by the monarchs unquestioningly. You don't question the monarch's laws. And there's a sense in which you can see government of that nature from ancient times. When you look at governance in ancient times, especially with the creation of monarchies, you find that is the nature, that is the order of the day, right? For Bible students, it's very interesting to see the rise of monarchy in ancient Israel, right? Remember that when the ancient Israelites called for a monarch, it was at a time when every man was alone unto himself, and the Israelites were really slaves of Philistines and other peoples around, and Syrians and so on. They were beaten up badly. They lived at the mercy of the nations around. There was a need for a confederacy and the need for a king. And Samuel gave them the king. But remember that Samuel's argument against the king was a very valid one. He pointed out that when you have a king, you're going to have to surrender your individual rights, right? Your daughters become, you know, the people whom he can take at will and marry at will. Your sons now become his servants and slaves, and so on. And your money has to be given to him in the form of taxes. So there's a tremendous surrender. All ancient governments were essentially like that. And in fact, the governments of Western Europe continued to be like that. And the rest of the world continued to be dictatorial, autocratic, dominant governments. And what Hobbes is doing is that he's providing a philosophical justification for monarchy, or that kind of government. Now, what is interesting is that Hobbes is doing that at a time when in England itself, monarchy was under threat. England had always had some recognition of the role of the individual since the time of the Norman invasions in the 13th century. The Anglo-Saxons always insisted that they should have certain fundamental rights, even though the Normans who were from France were now ruling them. And there was the famous Magna Carta, and the concept of the jury as integral to the justice system. And the jury was one in which, was an institution in which you ensured that no Frenchman could now execute an Englishman without the approval of Englishmen. So the jury had to sit and had to make a decision on the case. These were fundamental rights. The British Magna Carta of 1288. These are documents that have always defined in the British political tradition some measure of the recognition of the role of the people who are ruled. But Hobbes is writing at a time when there was an English Civil War. In fact, the Civil War of 1642. And in that Civil War, the king was executed. And the execution of the King Charles I led to the development of a commonwealth, what we will now refer to as a republic, for a short while under Oliver Cromwell. So there was Republican rule, but so attached were people to the idea of monarchy. Remember that in the Middle Ages, what had developed was a concept of the divine right of kings. Kings had a divine right. And that concept of the divine right of kings meant that God is the one who would put kings in their place. So attached were the English people to the idea of monarchy that Cromwell did not perpetuate the Commonwealth status or Republican government in Britain, but eventually gave way to the return of the king, right? So the monarchy was restored, but restored only on the grounds that it shared power with Parliament. Most European leaders had parliaments, but the parliaments were merely consultative. Now, however, the British Parliament became a powerful agency that had to consent to it had the power, it was given the authority to approve the laws that were passed by the king. and without their approval, the laws could not be enacted. Now, that is eventually that was reconfirmed in what came to be called the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in Britain. And this was contemporary with many of these writers. Hobbes lived during the English Civil War. He didn't live long enough to witness the Glorious Revolution, but it was Locke that experienced both of them, and Locke is the next one that we will be talking about. Well, John Locke is regarded as one of the greatest philosophers, I would say, that ever lived, certainly one of the greatest British philosophers. Some people regard him as the greatest British philosopher. Others give that entitlement to David Hume that we'll be coming to next day. But John Locke laid a very powerful foundation for the whole tradition of British empiricism. He wrote a book called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Incidentally, the book that Hobbes had written was called Leviathan. And Leviathan is the name of a mythical creature that comes out of, I think, the book of Job. But Leviathan is an image. It stands for the monarch and the power of the monarch, right? Locke, on the other hand, right, began by looking at the whole question of human understanding or the human mind. And Locke, again, established a very firm foundation in his philosophy of mind, a firm foundation for the tradition of British empiricism. He argued for the empirical method in the essay concerning human understanding as the basis for knowledge, insisting that it is only on experience, and that is sensory evidence, that knowledge could be attained. Reason, again, as the earlier empiricist had admitted, was significant, but reason was secondary to actual human experience. Reason was secondary to the reception of knowledge through the senses. And so Locke's empiricism was based essentially, again, on a very sound theory of mind, philosophy of mind. He came up with a very famous phrase, and that is the phrase tabula rasa. It's a Latin term, tabula rasa, meaning a clean slate. The notion is that the human mind is a clean slate. And again, a very important notion because it goes against a vast tradition of Western European philosophical thinking, going back to Plato and Pythagoras and so on. Remember, in Plato, the mind comes, the individual is born with a mind that still retains memories of a previous life. Even though that notion, right, of metempsychosis, that notion of the transmigration of souls, in which memories, recollections can be recovered from a previous mind. And remember, the Socratic method was one that was intended and designed to unravel many of those elements. Descartes had rejected that. The modern philosophers had rejected that. Even the medievals had rejected it because medieval thinking was Christian thinking, and Christian thinking had rejected that notion of the transmigration of souls. But even in medieval thinking, there were innate ideas, and that tradition, that notion of being born with innate ideas was something that was retained by René Descartes and all of the other rationalists, that we are born with certain innate ideas in our heads. And these ideas are the ideas that govern our thinking. Locke totally rejected that. And his argument was that we are born with nothing of our mind. There is no transcript, either from a previous life or from the womb. At that time, there was no understanding of genetics. So we couldn't talk about a genetic code, right? That wired you for a certain predisposition in your thinking. So Locke argued the mind was a blank slate, a tabula rasa. and that knowledge only is derived from your intuitions of that external world, from observation, from perception, auditory, as well as other sensory experiences, provide you with a knowledge of the world in which you live. And so that notion of the mind as a tabula rasa became quite a very popular idea. And when he looked at the world around, he saw the world around essentially as consisting of objects, but that even though the mind is a tabula rasa, the mind endows those objects with certain kinds of qualities. Locke came up with the notion that all objects in the natural world have primary qualities and secondary qualities, right? You take a watch, for example. A watch is an object in the external world. It's a hard object. It's comprised of a certain kind of metallic stuff, and those things are primary qualities, right? It's something that is tangible. I can see it, I can feel it, and so on. It's solid, right? It certainly, those are qualities that are primary qualities. But my watch is a very beautiful watch. It's well constructed. It has certain aesthetic qualities. My watch also is very useful. Its aesthetic qualities, its beauty, its utility, these are secondary qualities. These are qualities that I endow the object with. And so Locke's notion of primary and secondary qualities in the objects of the external world becomes a very fundamental idea. So Locke was creating a worldview, a massive and vast philosophical system, which provided explanations for almost all aspects of the external world and our experience of that external world. Locke is known as an individual who really loved truth and pursued truth at all costs. When you read the writings of Locke, you realize how much he was like the other writers, Hobbes and so on, immersed in Christian thought. In fact, in his book, Essay Concerning Human Understanding, and later on in his books on politics, almost all of his references, or his major references, come not only from the world of experience, but from the literature of the Bible. Right? He cites the literature of the Bible and the experiences of ancient Israelites, right, in order to develop many of his philosophical positions. So again, here is a philosopher who is certainly avoiding the metaphysical qualities of Christian theology to find a firm groundwork for the establishment of what is essentially still a Christian worldview, but based exclusively on reason, not on revelation, not on faith, but only on reason. In fact, he argues that all of the dogmas of faith must be substantiated, right, by not only man's rational mind, but it must be substantiated by the evidences that we acquire from that external world through the empirical method or through the scientific method, right? He rejected dogmatism, right? And he believed that, as I said, that revelation must be judged by reason. Hobbes' philosophy is a philosophy that essentially erodes the foundations of metaphysical thinking. He's totally opposed to metaphysical thinking, right? He's a nominalist insofar as his understanding of universals is concerned. This attack on metaphysics is an essential characteristic of the British empirical method. The European rationalism is metaphysical. When you look at European rationalism, reason can identify truths, but the truths that reason identifies are not truths of physics. They are truths beyond physics. And therefore, the European rationalistic tradition was a tradition that was creating a new kind of metaphysics, not a metaphysics equivalent to the theological metaphysics of the medieval period, but a rationalistic metaphysics. The British tradition is anti-metaphysical. It is it is essentially based on physics, on natural philosophy, on a direct examination of the natural world, on the use of my sensory apparatus in my understanding of that world, in the reception of the sense data that are impressed on my tabula rasa, my clean slated mind, insofar as the acquisition of knowledge is concerned. So Hobbes's contribution, therefore, to that whole philosophical enterprise is an extremely significant one. But perhaps Hobbes's lasting influence, right, is really in the field of political philosophy. And Hobbes became one of the greatest political philosophers, right, not only in the British tradition, but in the whole Western tradition. Remember that Aristotle and Plato had laid the foundations for political thinking. Plato's main book, right, his main treatise was The Republic, which essentially stated the requirements for the establishment of an ideal state. And then Aristotle wrote The Politics, where he defined the different kinds of constitutions and the nature of governance and the responsibility of governance. The medievals, starting with Augustine, talked about the city of God versus the city of man, but gave preeminence to the city of man, of God, in fact, not the city of man. And that tradition continued within medieval thinking. So the church assumed a priority over the state. Now the church has found itself embroiled in tremendous internal controversies. There are the wars of the Reformation. There is a splintering of Christianity and the fragmentation of the structures, right, of Christian religion. And people have to return to the city of man, as it were. They have now to recognize the centrality of the role of governance, of human governance. And Hobbes makes his contribution there advocating monarchy. Now, Locke, to a large extent, lived during the Civil War, the English Civil War, and certainly up to the time of the Glorious Revolution. And there's a sense in which Locke's philosophy is reflecting, right, what transpired in the British experience of revolution and civil war, and the establishment of the Commonwealth, which was essentially a republic, and in the sharing of government with Parliament, the sharing of government between king and Parliament. So Locke lived through that, and in a way, his writings reflected that. But his writings not only reflected the political status quo, it attempted to regulate and give direction to the form that government should take. And so a lot of Locke's writings were really writings in political philosophy. And there are two famous books that he wrote, the Letters on Toleration and two treatises on government. Now, Locke advocated toleration at a time when governments were still very intolerant, where people were killed for their religion. During those wars of religion in England, people were killed. The Inquisition did not end in Europe. The Inquisition only came to an end later with the French Revolution, right, of the 18th century and early 19th century. But people were still persecuted for religious beliefs. And Locke was advocating tolerance. Very important term, because it's a term that appears in Trinidad's own motto of governance. We talk here about discipline, production, and tolerance. And tolerance is something that was first advocated by John Locke. He wrote a number of treatises where he advocated that people should be granted the right to their religious ideas. I mean, in discussing tolerance and the right of an individual to articulate his own views, his own ideas, and so on, is something that laid the foundation for the whole philosophy of natural law, of fundamental human rights, right? That whole human rights philosophy has its origins in the writings of John Locke. Locke's talked about the right to property. We need to have a right to own property, a right to freedom of speech, and a right to freedom of religion, and that has become a dominant theme in Western philosophical thinking and now global thinking. The notion of human rights is expanding enormously in the last few decades of the 20th century and the early decades of the 21st century. People are adding to the concept of rights And rights is now be extending beyond the human, fundamental rights. And Locke is saying that we are born with natural rights. We're endowed with these natural rights by God. And that we should be allowed to pursue, right, our own happiness in whatever way we wish. So his writings on the question of toleration and its establishment of the foundation of a philosophy of natural rights is crucial, it's central to the Lockean system. He also advocated, right, the nature of what we now come to call liberal governments, the philosophical liberalism. And liberalism really points to the role that the people must play in the governance of our country. If people are free, and liberal means free, if people are free, then they must participate in the government of their country. The government must be for them, that they must be allowed to have a say in what happens in the country. And that led to the birth of, and during the Glorious Revolution, that is what happened. That led to the birth of parliamentary governance. That governance really is shared responsibility for legislation and for execution of law between Parliament and King. Britain still has a king, so the British were not opposed to monarchy, but monarchy, the king is no longer like kings of former years, because the king now is merely, the queen is ceremonial in England. She plays the part of our president in Trinidad. It's more ceremonial position. She's a representative of the state. She represents the state, but the prime minister really has the power. At the time of Locke, it was a power shared between ministers of government and the monarch. And it is Locke that laid the philosophical foundation for what is came to be called liberalism, political liberalism. Later on, we refer to it as liberal democracy, but the word democracy really is used more popularly after the time of the French Revolution. So John Locke really made a tremendous contribution to the development of Western democratic society. Later on, when we come to the French Revolution, we'll see how very popular it was. That concept was. Now, Lockean ideas not only were well established in England, in Britain, but Lockean ideas came to be very influential in Western Europe. In fact, the two Englishmen who became extremely popular and whose writings began to shape the thinking of Western Europeans were John Locke, the philosopher, and Isaac Newton, the scientist. Now, we hinted at Newton before. The greatest scientist who ever lived, the man who established the concept of natural law. And Locke was working within and against that kind of intellectual background, that kind of philosophical background, the concept of natural law and so on. And these ideas were ideas that had infiltrated, right, the ethos of Western European peoples. Their writings became extremely popular, but their writings were dangerous to a large extent, because European governments were not, the Europeans did not have the experiences of the English or of the British. Government was dictatorial, right? You had the Bourbons in France and so on. Louis XIV, for example, boasted that I am the state. L'État, c'est moi. I am the state, and I am accountable to nobody, and I do not share my power with Parliament. There was a Parliament, but that Parliament only served an advisory function, and it met only at his good pleasure, and to confirm what he had already decided. So government was extremely autocratic throughout Western Europe. There was the Bourbon Empire of the French, and there was the Holy Roman Empire of the Germanic peoples and so on. Two great empires, in addition to other territories or countries in Western Europe, very, very politically splinterized, but they were all sovereigns who did not share their power. And therefore, Lockean ideas began to establish in the minds of Europeans very radical views about government. And it is essentially Locke and Newton, right? In addition to the rationalists, yes, but Locke and Newton that were laying the foundations for the development of what came to be called the Enlightenment movement in Western Europe. Enlightenment movement is the next stage that we're going to be coming to after we complete our discussion of the Renaissance and the early modern European philosophers. But they were laying foundations, their ideas were laying the foundations of the Enlightenment period, setting the groundwork for the outbreak of revolution in Europe, right? And the radical transformation of government, the rise of democracy, the spread of what has now come to be called liberal democracy in Western Europe. So Locke and Newton were very, very powerful thinkers. And their influence extended well beyond Europe to well beyond England or Britain to Western Europe. The ideas also were pervasive in the colonies of North America. In fact, a lot of the North American new federalist writings, the revolutionary statements, the opposition to British governments and British control were influenced by the writings of John Locke and other European thinkers. And America began to produce its own thinkers, its own writers, right? And laid the foundation of the groundwork for the American Revolution, which would have been the first revolution within Western European empire, where territory would now assert its independence or autonomy from the British governments. So Locke played a tremendously important part in his notion of democratic government, a natural law of human rights, the concept of freedom, right? The rights to enjoy certain kinds of freedoms. It is Locke that made a very, very significant contribution to those developments in Western Europe. So I end here. And next year we are going to be looking at two other British thinkers, George Berkeley and David Hume.